special as we take a look at the state of the nation. We are joined by hundreds of the Chicago community at the Southside YMCA in an effort to spark social change in our country. And the discussion continues with our next guest. We are so thrilled to have political analyst, professor of sociology at Georgetown, Michael Eric Dyson. Michael, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Definitely a tough time in our country right now,
no doubt,
as we have been discussing. What are your thoughts on the social unrest going on around the nation?
Well, it's indicative of the extraordinary tensions that persist in a nation that has unresolved conflicts and ideas about race in America. The original sin of America is with us. The inability to overcome those barriers and obstacles that have been put into the place of people who seek to live a life free of those impediments. But it also suggests that everything is not equal. You know, we have discussions and conversations about the police on the one hand, whom we certainly appreciate and respect for the jobs that they do, and citizens on the other hand. But it's not an equal thing. When a police person shows up with a badge and a gun, he or she has the authority of the state behind him, the imprimatur of the state behind her to execute their will. And often the execution of their will as a judge and jury on the streets leads to chaos for Latino, African American, and other minority people. On the other hand, you have extraordinary tensions in communities generated from the kind of violence and crime that we see going on. Now, people, I think, have a misnomer. They call it black on black crime. It ain't black on black crime. People kill where they live. If you have an integrated community, you would have integrated killing. The reality is that 93% of people of color who die, black people in particular who die at the hands of black people. 84% of white people who die at the hands of white people. We don't have a narrative for white on white crime. So the point is, it's neighbor to neighbor carnage. What are those neighborhoods looking like? If they are depleted of the play that Isaiah Thomas spoke about, if they are depleted of the recreational outlets that people should have access to, if they have poor education, if the downward turn in the economy, the shift from manufacturing to service industries sends all of the resources out to the suburbs, and in the inner city, they are left depleted of any kind of buffer against that kind of economic devastation, then you have a recipe for chaos. That ain't no racial thing at that level. That's about the inequalities that prevail.
Now, you know how far you and I go back, and you know that I lean on you to educate me on a lot of different issues, and I certainly don't mind being educated right here on live television. But let me throw out, based on what you just explained,
right.
I need you to explain something to me. You say it's neighbor to neighbor carnage. We don't want to go by black on black crime. Fair enough. But when you hear that 316 killings have taken place, when you hear that African Americans account for 24% of those fatally shot and killed by police, despite being just 13% of the U.S. population, then you go to other things where we're doing things to ourselves, even though they exist in other communities, white on white crime, Latino on Latino crime, et cetera, et cetera. We get all of that. I keep bringing up the reality that we're playing a numbers game. That's why I wanted to do the show from here. Because when you think about what you've heard about Chicago and how you've got black folks really taking their own out, when you think about the numbers game and white folks making up about 66% of the population, the Latino community making up about 17% of the population, projected to double in populace by the year 2039, but the black population is hovering around 13 to 14%, and it's only projected to go up 15%. To me, we are in danger. So I look at it from a numbers perspective, and I say, even though your classification is absolutely accurate and indisputable, nevertheless, we got to bring it home and figure out how to address this problem and resolve it. What would you suggest?
Well, I go absolutely right. There's no question that, as witnessed by the people who are here, there is a serious concern with the devastation that goes on in our communities. You go to any church. One of the blackest men in Chicago is here, Father Flager, sitting up here in this situation right now. And the reality is, and I have preached at his church many times, and I look forward to coming back soon. And what's interesting is that he is on the front lines of trying to litigate in his congregation a brief and an argument against the devastation that we so easily embrace. But what he also is about, and what we should be about as well, is that there are people who are accomplices to that murder. You see black people murder and you go, oh, what you're doing. What are the accomplices? The accomplices are the social negligence. The accomplices are the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of human beings. The accomplices are, we're in Chicago. You know better than anybody else. tape after tape, recording after recording, Laquan McDonald and others, where police people without fear execute their will on the streets with unarmed young black people. And I'm saying to you that if you don't deal with the fact that the structural problems that prevail and the obstacles and impediments that are there are accomplices to people hurting and harming themselves. That's not about being black. That's about having lack of access to education and relief from suffering that people are confronted with.
You're right about that, but here's the question, Doc. Some would argue that black folks, as a nation of people, had it worse at one time. Those very things that you pointed to, the inequities, absence of civil rights, unemployment, education, etc. We were denied opportunities to pursue greatness. We were denied opportunities to educate ourselves. Throughout history, and somehow, some way, we appeared more together then than we do now. What does Dr. Michael Dyson say about that?
A couple of things. Appear is a critical word here. Social media puts a light on, puts a spotlight on things that already existed, but we didn't know. So when you're talking about the 30s and 40s and 50s, when you talk about A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, when you speak about Mary McLeod Bethune, there was devastation in black communities then. There's a kind of nostalgia that has prevailed to talk about a golden age of segregation when black people were to themselves and we controlled things. Now, it is true that when you were forced to go to Howard and not Harvard, when you were forced to go to a historically black college and university, there was a tremendous concentration of high intelligence and critical insight about the problems that prevailed. But once desegregation came along and black people were able to flee to suburbs and exurbs, able to leave the inner city core, able to leave the urban center, the devastation was concentrated upon those who were left behind. So it is absolutely true that black people were able to survive in the midst of white supremacy and social injustice and the racial terror that was unleashed. But the reality is now those people have been left behind without resources. And those of us who have made it, those of us who have television shows and those of us who teach at elite institutions of higher education do not often live in those communities. Though you saw the news report in the New York Times the other day that said even if you're black middle class, you're stuck in Milwaukee, they were talking about, still in those communities. So when you talk about that, it's not that black people are now worse off today than we were yesterday, but what happens is we begin to see the consequences of, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the failure of our country. He said, look, Voting Rights Act was simple. Civil Rights Bill was simple. He said, let me tell you something now that's going to change the nation and we'll charge it. To get rid of poverty and economic inequality. And so when you look at a point, when you talk about your man Mark Cuban, when Mark Cuban says, look, as that Broadway play said, everybody's a little racist, but it ain't equal. Mark Cuban is a billionaire looking at the fact that, yes, I may be scared of a white skinhead, but a white skinhead has not been the basis for laws being changed in America, having been historically lynched or castrated or murdered or denied opportunity. So hoodie wearing is not an equal distribution of stigma, because the very people who were born that stigma happen to be people of color who have not been acknowledged as human beings.
Furthermore, and I'm not saying this